and we're going to talk about hair algae.
Yeah.
I've had nightmares about this, and especially when I was starting, and after I did some major changes into my tank, and I know you've had your battles with it.
Absolutely. It's one thing that it can really drive you crazy, and it's I've seen people break tanks down over it.
Yeah,
Kids
and
can't get rid of it.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have our head engineer Don,
Yeah.
and he actually had to break down his tank completely, remove all the sand, remove all the rock, and start from scratch because he just could not, whatever he did, he could not get rid of that hair algae. Tank is doing much better now, which is pretty much a new tank.
Right.
But yeah, it's one of those things that whether you're a beginner or you're an advanced user, you're not immune to it. And when it hits, sometimes if you're lucky, you can get rid of it. Sometimes it's awful. It's awful.
Yep.
The one thing that we have nowadays compared to 20 years ago when you and I used to fight it all the time is that there have been a great deal of advancements in terms of identification, also prevention, and also dealing with it if you have it.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that today. All right. So if you've never heard from us before, or if you're first time listening, this is CoralVue Podcast. We do this every week, week, we try to. So, okay, let's talk about hair algae, Dave.
Yeah.
What is hair algae?
It's a nuisance algae, but basically brought on, in my belief, by excessive contaminants in the water, such as nitrates and phosphates. This is really what is gonna bring that algae out. When those levels get out of control, this was one of the ramifications of that.
And I want to make it clear because I know this is the internet, which means that somebody always has an opinion, and is that hair algae is not all that bad at all. But just like in life, too much of something is no good, because you and I will agree that hair algae in itself, it's a great nutrient export. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about what we call an algae scrubber, where you can actually harvest this algae to take advantage of its benefits without getting out of hand. But it is what we're going to talk about today is when the hair algae gets out of hand and it's everywhere.
Yeah. It's basically trying to contaminate that hair algae in a location outside of the display for nutrient export.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's talk about the proliferation of green hair algae, to be more exact. And there are several elements, and you touched one already, which is nutrients. And we're talking about nitrates and phosphates, correct?
Yep.
So how is nitrates and phosphates contribute to the hair algae?
Just the pollutants in the water, lack of water changes, insufficient protein skimming. Those are, two big things that are really gonna, put those levels to a point where you can't get hair algae under control.
Yeah, I think hair algae is like a weed to me, which means that it'll feed on anything. Anything you put out there. They can feed on very, very tough environments, as long as you give it nitrates and phosphates, as long as you give it food, fertilizer, which in this case would be nitrates and phosphates, and a couple of other things, but mainly nitrates and phosphates, and it'll grow. So controlling your nitrates, controlling your phosphates would be one way of controlling it. Another thing that people don't pay attention to is there's certain trace elements such as iron and iodine that are also considered fertilizers. If you're a person that likes the garden, you probably know about iron, and you probably know about iodine, phosphates as well, because they all contribute to the plant growth. And
Yeah.
literally, algae is a plant that just keeps growing out of control. So I think that those trace elements, iron, manganese, and also iodine and fluoride, are things that contribute to hair algae.
And
So
I think about iron too, Carlos, because it's, we need that trace element in a tank, but every time it seems like you measure for it, it's undetectable.
yes.
And it's easy to overdose that iron because you think, oh, well, I don't see any.
Absolutely. And you brought up a great keyword, and I think it's what takes us to the next segment, and it's measuring.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, I think we talked about it. We definitely talked about it in cyanobacteria and dinoflagellates. It's ICP testing,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason why is this really, there are tests out there that you can actually, like titration tests that you can use for iron and iodine. But to be honest, I don't think they are as accurate as we need them to be in order for it to work. I mean, they work.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but in this case, they just don't go down as precise or as low as we need them to go. So in this case, you have to have an ICP test.
Yeah, it really is a great tool. That is, there's a lot of people out there, companies that are doing it now, but great tool that's really helped advance the hobby, in my opinion.
Yeah. Just to be 100% clear and 100% transparent, we here at CoralVue, we distribute Fauna Marine, and Fauna Marine has a test, an ICP test that you can purchase and send out. So I want to clarify that. I hate when people go online and say things and they don't clarify what ties they have to the companies. So here at CoralVue, Dave, myself, and everybody, we also distribute Fauna Marine. So yes, you can use a Fauna Marine test, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But you know what? Any ICP test, you're fighting a pest, whatever you feel comfortable with. If it's company A, B, or C, it really doesn't make a difference. Just get an ICP test so you get a better understanding of what's going on in your tank and what's actually feeding that hair algae.
Well, let me mention too that not all ICP tests, even Fauna, test for fluoride. And I've really learned from Claude at Fauna how important the role fluoride plays in the reef tank. And if you don't have that, you don't have uptake of other essential elements.
And we can tell you right now, what we've learned is that hindsight is 20/20, because Kaltwasser is this great thing that we can add. It adds buffer, it adds alkalinity, it adds calcium to your tank. It seems like the perfect, magic juice. But as time has gone by and we get better at investigating and testing, we've actually learned that there's a dark side to Kaltwasser. And the dark side to Kaltwasser is that, just like we've known for years that Kaltwasser precipitates phosphates,
right?
It binds to phosphates and then they fall down. Intuitively, you start asking, it's like, wait a minute, if it precipitates phosphates, how does it single out just phosphates, or does it bind to other elements that we don't know about? Because it's very hard to even assume that, it only does phosphates, it doesn't do anything else. That's likely is not that. It's the opposite. And that's what it's turned out to be, that if you're using Kaltwasser, it binds to fluoride, and fluoride precipitates. And if fluoride precipitates, it's almost like you're taking that domino off the beginning of the track, and it just stops everything after it. Nothing happens because fluoride is not there. So test everything. So you got to test for iodine, you test for iron, you test for manganese, you test for fluoride, you test for nitrates, and you test for phosphate, because all of those 6 things are related together and they contribute to the hair algae. Hair algae is like fine hair. It's like baby hair. It's green, and it could be attached to the substrates, it could be attached to rocks, and also it could be attached to equipment. I've seen it attached to the cable going to a pump.
I got that in my refugium now. It's actually attached to the cable, and
exactly. So it grows really fast. One day you see it's like little tiny stubby thing, and next thing you know, it's like 2 inches long. And it creates this dense mats that you feel like you can just go down there with your hand and pull it off and it comes off because it looks like that, but it's no. That thing is attached like, by chains, nails, and staples.
Right.
I mean, it's just not coming out. So I think observation is critical. Yeah. Because it starts really small and it starts in corners and you start looking at it. Sometimes it starts in the rock crevices where the crevices are, and then you see this green tuft coming out of that one, and you're like, okay, then we got some hair algae. Yeah. So let's talk about preventing hair algae. Okay. Yep. We talked about nutrients.
Yep.
So nutrients was kind of like that. Again, going back to that nitrate to phosphate ratio, which works with cyanobacteria and works with dinoflagellates, which is per every 1 phosphate, you have to have, 50 to 100 nitrates, which what that means is if you have 5 ppm nitrates, you should have 0.05 phosphates. That's the correct ratio. If that's off, then you're going to have issues. Lighting, Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Improper light ratio, spectrum plays a big role.
I think that's becoming, obviously, I think it's becoming less of an issue unless you buy a really bad quality LED light. But I remember back in the days when you and I started, if your metal halide bulb was 2 years old, it was already shifting spectrum, and it's going to just grow algae.
Yeah.
If your VHOs, T5s, PCs were too old, they would also start shifting and grow algae. I think nowadays with the LEDs, it's not as big of a deal if you buy a reputable light out there. There's a lot. You can find anything on eBay and Alibaba, but that doesn't mean that is, and it could be cheap, but it doesn't mean it's the correct spectrum. Okay. And then filtration, lack of filtration, Dave.
Absolutely. I mean, that goes back to efficient protein skimming is really a key point in combating this type of nuisance.
And we have a whole show, a podcast on properly sizing skimmer, just because, again, this is going back to the internet. There's so much information in the internet, but that information doesn't mean it's correct.
Yeah.
Back in the days when we had downdrafts, we had the big skimmers. The rule of thumb is buy the biggest skimmer and the biggest pump you can, because the skimmers were so inefficient. Nowadays, the skimmers are so efficient that there's actually, kind of like most manufacturers pair the skimmer to a size of a tank.
Yeah.
So you have to buy the properly sized skimmer. And there's a whole show on skimming that we've done. So make sure that you go into the podcast and go to the history and find it. And we talk about how to properly pair a skimmer, because you can pay a lot of money for a skimmer that won't do anything for you.
Yeah.
All right. So what about removing organics, something as simple as filter socks, something as simple as some kind of mechanical fleece like the Clear.
Yeah.
Great tool. I think also if you have any type of sponges or anything, you have to clean them out, because if you leave that stuff in there and it traps things in it, then that stuff decays and it just becomes a nitrate factory.
Yeah.
Cleaning your sump too, another thing. And I know it's almost impossible to clean your sump, but having a little pump, a little power head in the sump that you can just grab any and then just siphon it out or just blow it out so that it gets back into the tank and then it goes through the filtration. That is huge.
Anywhere you see it's holding detritus.
Yep.
That's really, you want to get on top of that, because that can definitely be a source where it will spurt out.
Exactly. So let's talk about removing the hair algae.
Yeah.
And
manual.
Manual, mechanical, chemical. Okay. So manual removal. That's 100% elbow grease right there.
Yeah, it's torture. I mean,
it's torture.
Because its stuff is so fine. It's like pulling a slippery mat or something through your fingers to try and pull it.
And sometimes, Dave, I've never been able to just pull it out. I've actually have to have like a hard bristle toothbrush and just get in there and scrub. And nowadays they have this underwater electrical, like a toothbrush, but it's a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
So you can just go in there and sit in there and go, and so you can, that helps a lot. Okay. So physically remove the hair algae as much as you can. If there's a piece of rock that is just sitting there and is full of hair algae, take it out.
Yeah.
Take it out. Okay. What about algae eating organisms?
Snails. That's my favorite.
Yes.
I mean, those suckers work. Get you, they do the work for you, and they clean it good.
Yeah, those Mexican turbo snails, they get big. I mean, they get a bit small and they get big, but they are awesome at cleaning hair algae.
Yeah.
They're not that fast. I mean, they're not going to clean your tank in a day.
Right.
But you know what? Once you've battled it, you put them in there, and then they'll take care of keeping things in.
Yeah.
It's like the goat of the sea. You put those suckers in there, and they'll just clear everything you put in there. What about other fish? Like, you have rabbitfish.
Yeah, tang.
You have tangs.
Yeah.
The lawnmower blenny, another great fish, and all that. I think with any fish, you just have to be careful of your other inhabitants. Will that fish play nice with other fish? You can also get sea urchins, and sea urchins are great. But keep in mind, once you get into living organisms, it's tough, because if you get a sea urchin, that's great. But if you have a trigger in your tank and you put a sea urchin in there,
yeah, he's gone.
We're talking about uni for that trigger, So you got to be careful with what you do. You got to make sure that you put the right fish, what you have. So, but let's talk about what most people jump onto, which is what I do myself. It's the chemical treatments.
Yeah.
All right. So what do we have in terms of chemical treatments that we can use?
First comes to my mind is Fluconazole is a go-to. And
yes,
it seems to work fairly well.
I mean, it over the last few years, it's become the go-to treatment when it comes to hair algae.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting how it works, because fluconazole is not an algicide. It's not. It doesn't kill the algae to begin with. To begin with. So, FYI, if you put fluconazole in your tank, do not expect the tank to be completely 100% clean the next day.
Yeah.
Okay. If you put fluconazole in your tank, it'll look, for the next 2 days or 3 days, it'll look like nothing happened. It just doesn't look like anything happened. But give it about 10 days to a couple of weeks, 14 days, and you start to see what fluconazole has done. And I was doing a little research online, and fluconazole interferes with the ergosterol production. So what it does is it prevents the algae cells to work correctly, and then the algae cells start to break down. And when they break down, it causes the algae to break down and die. So it doesn't really kill the algae, but what it does is it creates a break in the link of cells between the algae, and then the algae just kind of withers away, because it can't heal, it can't eat, it can't reproduce. The cells itself are dying, indirectly. So fluconazole indirectly kills the cells. Yeah. So I've done it. I've actually treated my tank. I actually treated my tank about 3-4 weeks ago with fluconazole. And it's fine. It's completely reef safe. It doesn't do anything to shrimp. The corals, they're perfectly fine. I think they say if you go too high, then it may kill your snails. But other than that, it really doesn't create any damage in there, and it only kills bryopsis and hair algae. It doesn't kill other type of algae out there. So if you have one thing interesting that both Dave and I were talking about before the show was that it didn't affect our scrubbers, our algae scrubbers.
Yeah. It was really amazing to me that I thought for sure it would totally wipe out my bed on the scrubbers, but it did not.
Yeah. So there's a couple of brands out there that you can purchase there's Fluconazole made for the Reef hobby. I think Blue Life
Yep.
USA. And there's a couple of other ones that do it. Or you can just purchase the actual Fluconazole, pills.
Mm.
It's called Fluco 200. And
Yeah.
it's a pill. It's a blue and white pill that they sell. And you just break the pill down and put the powder in there. That's what I've used always. I don't have any experience with the Reef branded Fluconazole. I've always used the actual blisters, and I use 1 pill per 10 gallons, and it works fantastic.
Yeah. I was going to mention there's some products out there, Carlos. I believe they have an algicide.
Yes.
Side of them.
Be careful.
Be careful. With some of these that are, I believe, still on the market, but
yeah,
we know this works and it's proven to be safe.
Yeah, it's proven to be safe. And if you don't believe us, Google it.
Yeah.
Google it. Just Google it and you'll see a lot of people have used it successfully. I've used it successfully and Dave has used it successfully. So I'm talking for firsthand experience, not that I heard it from somebody, and I guess it must be true. Like Ferris Bueller.
I've also, I give mention to Brightwell has some products called Razor that and also works well.
It works really well. Like anything else, just make sure that you read the label and make sure that you do in there. You educate it. If there's some component that you don't understand, it's so easy now. Back in the day, we had to go to the library and look it up. Nowadays, you just sit on your computer or your phone and type in the name and it'll come up with all the information. So there's no reason why you should not know what you're putting into your tank.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So another thing that I really like to combat hair algae is an algae scrubber.
I do too.
Which is kind of like is combat algae with algae.
Right. You're actually planning what you don't want in the tank, but
which is when
it's display.
Which is what nature does. Nature, there's places where it's full of hair algae and there's places where it's pristine because that's the balance. Obviously humans and, we can go into all the other things in here, but that's really what algae is intended to is it's a way for nature to export the nutrients out of the tank and then some other organism eats the algae. Yeah. So the scrubbers are fantastic. And I know, Dave, you have two and they work awesome.
They work awesome. Yeah. I mean, when I have to pull those things out, I'm talking pounds of algae that's coming off of it that I have to scrape off.
And the main concept is that you are creating this controlled environment where you put the algae, and that controlled environment where you have algae and you give it the perfect light, you give it the perfect water to air mixture and everything. So you create this incredibly favorable conditions where the algae grows so fast that it will outcompete the rest of the algae in the tank from the nutrients. So then the rest of the algae in the tank will die and it'll just grow and then you can just pull it right out and scrape it off, throw it away. And some people actually, depending on the algae that you have, will scrape it off and put it back in the tank because the tanks love it.
Eat it.
Yeah. So it's crazy. So it's a very natural, I couldn't even say holistic, way of doing things, using nature to combat nature's, imbalance.
Yeah. I tell anybody that you ever go to the beach and you see some rocks, it's like right on the shore.
Yes.
And you look at those rocks through the water and you see this whole bed of hair algae on it. And it's the whole, all over the oceans. But that's just nature. So you can see it firsthand that it is a real application.
Yeah. And you don't have to have a lot of space nowadays. Again, full transparency, we're CoralVue, so we also sell Ice Cap, which has algae scrubbers. So again, full transparency, we sell algae scrubbers. But again, Google it because you'll know. But we have in-sump algae scrubbers, external algae scrubbers. We have hang on the back algae scrubbers. So there's no excuse to not use an algae scrubber.
Yeah. And look, there's no magic to an algae scrubber, guys. I'd say if you got a pump and you want to make your own and you can go to Home Depot and buy a shop light and trickle water over some type of mesh, you're going to grow hair algae. I promise.
Yeah.
But you know, what we've done is try and make it a convenient and safe product, and we're using LEDs with it, and so yeah, it's a proven filtration method, and it works.
And I can tell you personally, and I think Dave, you're the same, is that I would never install a tank now without an algae scrubber.
Nope.
It just makes no sense.
Not especially if you want a lot of fish and you feed heavy.
Yes.
That, to me, it's almost a godsend, really, just like the protein skimmer. I got to give credit to my buddy Richard Back. He's the one that really turned me on to this probably 10 years ago. And I really wasn't, that educated on algae scrubber. But man, since that first one he sent me, I was a believer, because I could measure the reduction in PO4 in the tank. So it does work.
If you have a lot of patience, the algae scrubber may be what you want, or throw in a few snails and then you walk away, and then eventually, a few months, the hair algae will be gone. Or if you're the person that is like, I'm so sick and tired, I want this thing out, maybe Fluconazole would be the idea. So, I guess at the end of the day, you have options.
Yeah.
But, each option has its trade-off. Just educate yourselves on that one. But know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel if you treat it right. And let me clarify this. When it comes to algae scrubbers, when it comes to Fluconazole or any kind of chemical treatment, when it comes to fish, it doesn't fix the underlying issue.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you put Fluconazole in the tank, it'll kill the algae. But if you don't fix the underlying issue, which is the first segment that we cover, which is the nutrient and trace elements, deficiency or excess of, if you don't take care of that, it's going to come back. If you don't take care of that, the fish are not going to be able to keep up with it, because they gets to a point where they like the short young growth, but after it gets to a certain length, it becomes bitter and fish won't touch it. Yeah, same thing with snails. So please know that what the chemicals, fish, scrubber, those are ways to handle the results, but not the actual underlying problems. On the underlying problems, ICP, nutrient testing. Make sure that you test, because the way the works is that nitrates and phosphates, also iron, magnesium, manganese, iodine, and fluoride, they all have to be at a particular level. And if one of those 6 gets off the level, it'll increase your chances for hair algae. If 2 of this are off the chart, then it'll increase even more. Then you have, more, 15%, then you have 30%, then you have 45% chances of getting algae. So make sure that you ICP test to understand what's happening in your tank, so you're not blindly just trying to patch.
Hey, let me give another shameless plug to Fauna, because we've mentioned before, after you get, I believe it's 5 tests,
yes,
this AI technology comes into play, where they can actually predict problems. So this is something that they look for on the test, is the ratios between these elements, and they can actually help you forecast and tell you, hey, I may have something going on here. I may be growing hair algae here pretty soon. I need to take action.
And it's that's the ticket, because it allows you to see the elements, how they play together. And if you see something it's off, then you can fix it before it even manifests into hair algae in your system. So you can prevent hair algae from happening just by understanding.
Yeah.
So
wow.
ICP testing, must, whether you use whatever company you use, but make sure that that company tells you how most companies tell you the individual elements, but there's very few ICP companies that actually tell you how the elements play together. Iodine by itself, yeah, that's great. But if iodine is below a certain or above a certain level, then it's not going to play well with something else, and that's going to cause problems. And that's where the AI comes in. the benefits of. So if you do an ICP test, make sure that you do your research in terms of what they can provide you, because that's the difference between having data and having information.
That it is.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for watching. Thank you to our producers. Again, if you like what you hear, if you like what you see, subscribe, hit the bell button. We're on Spotify, we're on YouTube. All right. And we'll talk to you later.